be opening remarks of 10 to 12 minutes by each of the speakers, followed by a panel discussion, and then we'll get all of you involved. But first, please welcome Ambassador Poised, the Norwegian Ambassador to the United States, who will formally open today's proceedings. No problem. Please welcome the Ambassador. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people here this morning. A special thanks to George Washington University's program of Extremism and the Norwegian Research Establishment, FFI. Together you have done a great job organizing this morning's event. For those of you who don't know FFI, the institute is based in Oslo and has been one of the world-leading centers for academic research on jihadism. I'm sure many of you will recognize both Anne Stenersen and Thomas Hegghammer as global leaders in this field. It's great to have you here. It's also great to have some of my colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here today, doing this together with the university, FFI, and the ministry. So good to have you here, and I hope you will have a great morning. Sorry. Let me also thank the many colleagues from the U.S. government present here today for the United States global leadership in the field of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. It's also good to see Chris Costa here this morning. The United States and Norway have been close partners in these efforts for many, many years. I was, some years back, the Norwegian ambassador to Afghanistan, and I witnessed firsthand how close this partnership is on the ground between Norway and the United States. Here in the U.S., I see the full scope of this cooperation, whether it is U.S. and Norwegian troops fighting side by side in Afghanistan and Iraq, or seamless intelligence cooperation, or through joining forces to prevent radicalization and violent extremism globally. We truly cherish this cooperation. As you heard from the title for this event, Jihadism after the Caliphate is timely. It is a key topic when the foreign minister of the global coalition to defeat ISIL meets here in Washington, D.C. in a couple of days, and then chaired by Secretary Pompeo. They will discuss many of the same topics that will be looked at today. What should the global coalition against ISIL look like in the future? How do we support our regional partners in the next phase? What are the trajectories for ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates? In our collective efforts to combat terrorism and violent extremism, we have made substantial progress. But as we all know, the threat remains widespread and it remains complex. ISIL is not yet defeated, and their tactics have diversified. We are on the brink of a new phase, and we need a comprehensive approach in that regard. In the coming months, we are faced with new security challenges, such as the return, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign fighters and those associated with them, including women, girls, and boys. Our penitentiary institutions and other institutions must be fit both to rehabilitate those who return and to discover individuals at risk and prevent further radicalization. The underlying drivers of terrorism are still present and perhaps even stronger than before. If we ever needed reliable and precise research on the threat from international terrorism, it is now. What really makes a difference is our collective efforts, and our individual contributions matter. And let me then briefly highlight some of Norway's efforts in this field. We support the 5 lines of efforts of the Global Coalition Against ISIL. In the period of 2011 to 2017, Norway has provided more than $1 billion in support of humanitarian efforts in Syria and the neighboring countries. We support the efforts of the UN for a political solution in Syria, also through the efforts of UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen. Last year, our support to Iraq was approximately $44 million, including stabilization efforts. Military contribution this year, 60 army personnel to train and advise Iraqi troops in Al-Assad, Anbar. We will also contribute with a few personnel in 2019 to do training in military intelligence, and personnel to NATO training mission is planned for also this year. A major focus for Norway is preventing violent extremism. We are co-chairs of the UN group of Friends of Preventing Violent Extremism. Together with our Jordanian partners, we will continue to put these issues high on the UN agenda. Last year also, the Minister of Foreign Affairs presented a new strategy on the Sahel. Security is one of the greatest challenges to economic growth in this region. To deal with these challenges, we must ensure that our policies are based on facts and not on assumptions. We need more research on terrorist trends, both regionally and globally, and on the intersection between terrorism and other global security threats. Sharing new analysis through platforms such as this meeting enables an open and frank dialogue between policymakers and researchers. That is the main objective of today's event. I look forward to hearing your recommendation, and thanks again for being here this morning. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, invite the panelists to come forward. And again, this is a really fantastic opportunity to listen to three of the leading kind of researchers in this field today. And I think if it's okay, we'll follow the order in the program, and we'll start with Dr. Ann Stenison, who will open today's discussion. A senior research fellow at FFI's Terrorism Research Group, Dr. Stenison's research covers a range of themes, including terrorism modus operandi, terrorist use of the internet, and CBRN terrorism. Many of you here would know her best from her work on Al-Qaeda and jihadism more broadly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which she covers in her excellent book, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So thank you, Anne.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. I will start straight on to my presentation. I only have 10 minutes, I think, so this necessarily has to be brief. Basically, my presentation will be about the Al-Qaeda and the future of Al-Qaeda within the broader context of the global jihadist movement. A little bit about how Al-Qaeda is thinking strategically and how they're responding to the military part of the war on terror. So this will be my focus, and my colleagues here will talk more about, I think, softer counterterrorism measures and ideology and this and these other topics that are, of course, also very important, but I will limit myself today. Global jihadism as an ideology will continue to exist. I think that's there is much consensus already about this topic. The reason why global jihadism will continue to exist as an ideology has been described by many scholars, including myself, in a recent article I wrote in the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, which is called Jihadism After the Caliphate, basically. And that's not going, so I will not elaborate on the reasons why I think global jihadism will continue to exist. Instead, I will talk about what the future configuration of the global jihadi movement will be, because that's what I think is at the center of current debates. Basically, for my whole research career, I've been studying Al-Qaeda, so I will now also limit myself to talking about Al-Qaeda and how they navigate in the current political environment. So my argument will be that both Al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS will continue to exist for the foreseeable future, but I think Al-Qaeda has the greatest chance of survival in the long run. simply because they have a certain mode of operation, which I believe is very sustainable and also very challenging for a counter-terrorist community to fight against. Let me briefly talk about this mode of operation, although I think that's, to some of you, that will be common knowledge. So Al-Qaeda's basic method, which has changed relatively little since Al-Qaeda was founded in the late 1980s, it is to insert itself into local insurgencies or local rebellions with an Islamist character. Not necessarily Salafi jihadi rebellions, but also Islamist rebellions of other kinds of ideologies. But the point is to have an environment from where to operate. And while Al-Qaeda is supporting this local Islamist insurgency, they will also carry out international terrorist attacks. So Al-Qaeda's most successful application of this mode of operation was in the 90s when they were hosted by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, where they supported the Taliban militarily and politically, and also at the same time planned international terrorist attacks from the soil of Afghanistan, but also from other parts of the world. And this pattern, at least in my opinion, I see it repeating itself even today after 2001, when conditions for Al-Qaeda have drastically changed because of the war on terror. The basic difference between Al-Qaeda pre and post 2001 is that prior to 9/11, Al-Qaeda was limiting itself to being based in one country, that was Taliban-run Afghanistan. Whereas post 9/11, Al-Qaeda is now present in many countries, in many local insurgencies at the same time, and with varying degrees of success. So we have this the so-called franchising model with an entity which we refer to as Al-Qaeda Central, consisting of Al-Qaeda's top leadership and Al-Qaeda franchises in different parts of the world. And the way I read Al-Qaeda's current propaganda strategic documents is that they're planning on continuing this model. The latest very clear evidence of that was Ayman al-Zawahiri's speech. He issued many speeches in 2018. One of them, where he talks very specifically about strategy, was the one issued in September, where he talks about basically Al-Qaeda should be the vanguard of a global insurgency comprised of different front lines across the Muslim world, and they all ideally should work together against the main enemy, which is very clearly described, that's the United States. So in that sense, there's not much new. I mean, Al-Qaeda is not revolutionizing its mode of operation the way I see it at present. So in the context of the war on terror, there are two things that have weakened Al-Qaeda operations. I'm not an expert on this, but this is based on my reading of Al-Qaeda leaders and what they themselves say are weakening them, right? Both bin Laden and Zawahiri. So for Al-Qaeda's leaders, there have been two things that have really worried them and that they themselves identify as damaging Al-Qaeda after 2001. The first is the targeted attacks on their leaders in the form of drone strikes, but also in the form of local counter-terrorist operations, like in Pakistan, when Pakistani authorities arrested Al-Qaeda leaders and so on. But especially the drone strikes, of course, after 2008 and forward. So the targeted attacks on leaders has damaged Al-Qaeda, they say themselves. And the second one is when local insurgencies or local populations turn against Al-Qaeda. Like what happened in Iraq with the Anbar awakening, this was a very much a concern for bin Laden. And this is also why bin Laden and later Zawahiri has advised Al-Qaeda affiliates, especially with specific reference to the Anbar awakening, to try and prevent this from happening again. And to avoid a new Anbar awakening, basically the advice is for Al-Qaeda affiliates to be gentle on the local population, to focus on dawah, to preach but not to use violence, but to dawah and education, to educate the locals into a more Salafi orientation. Another specific advice has been to not declare an Islamic State until Al-Qaeda knows that the whole, basically, majority of the population will support such a state, and importantly, to defend such a state against an external aggression. And also on the issue of drone strikes, Al-Qaeda leaders have been very much aware of this and trying to adapt in various ways, which is more a more technical discussion. It's quite surprising sometimes when you read bin Laden's writings that he's very, very detailed about the technicality of how to avoid drone strikes, and sending this advice to his lieutenants. So the point is, Al-Qaeda is constantly adapting to these things that they think are most threatening to their organization. Now, it has been said that Al-Qaeda's main challenge today is that it's hard for them to reconcile the local with the global causes. So Al-Qaeda inserts itself into a local insurgency, but at the same time they want to promote a global anti-American agenda, and the local insurgents will not necessarily support that global agenda, and this is a struggle for Al-Qaeda. I think this is not currently, this is not the main challenge really, because Al-Qaeda also has, and historically they have had strategies to deal with the contradiction between the local and the global. And Al-Qaeda's main strategy, which I think is also the current and future method, will be to separate the local and the global military activities, let's say. So Al-Qaeda has always had a very small part of its organization being responsible for international terrorism. It had in the 1990s, it had their cell or their department, let's say, for external operations, as they call it, as a separate part of Al-Qaeda's organization, which works clandestinely and which works only in coordination with a very few top Al-Qaeda leaders. But they are not a part of the rest of Al-Qaeda, which deals with support to local insurgencies and preaching and education to the local population and so on. And running training camps, which is also a very important activity for Al-Qaeda to do in these local conflicts where they operate. So Al-Qaeda's strategy to deal with the local global contradiction is to continue the separation and, if possible, to work even more clandestinely with the international terrorist activities, if that's something that they have the capacity to do. So the last thing I will touch upon will be what does this mean for Al-Qaeda's future? Will there be more or less international terrorism? This is a topic that's very much on the agenda, of course, here in the United States, also in Europe. And to me, well, I'm sorry, but I don't have a clear answer to that. I'm debating constantly with myself, will Al-Qaeda prioritize carrying out terrorist attacks in the United States or not, you know? Myself, I'm going back and forth on this. But the conclusion that I've arrived at so far is that, again, with reference to Zawahiri's speech last year, there's a number of lessons, there's a number of hints in that speech. Basically, Al-Qaeda will definitely want to be the leader of the global jihadi movement. It already sees itself as the natural leader of global jihadism. It will take that position back from ISIS. The conflict with Islamic State, which we'll talk about more in detail, is something that has really occupied Al-Qaeda for the last couple of years. And now ISIS is on the retreat. Al-Qaeda will go in and fill this gap in leadership. Another thing that al-Zawahiri is talking about is that Al-Qaeda sees the war that they're fighting as a sort of global insurgency, as I said, with the Muslim world being the battlefield, having many separate fronts. Al-Qaeda sees itself as a revolutionary vanguard. Their task will be to try and coordinate the activity on the various fronts and to support the local Islamists wherever they can. Zawahiri is also saying that confronting the US is inevitable, perhaps not a surprise given that this has been Al-Qaeda's message all along, at least all along since the mid-1990s. But it's not clear exactly how Al-Qaeda will confront the US. I mean, there are two options. I think Al-Qaeda will do both according to their ability, and the two options are to fight guerrilla war in the Muslim world and to try and prioritize American targets and things like that, especially in conflict areas where you have Western military forces, like in West Africa, for example, where you have US and French and and an international coalition. So that's one option. This is basically what Al-Qaeda has been doing since the invasion of, since the start of the Afghanistan and Iraq war in 2001 and 2003. Zawahiri is talking about leading the Americans, which is a classical guerrilla warfare expression, I suppose. But it doesn't mean that they will not also try and carry out terrorist attacks outside the Muslim world. I think Al-Qaeda aspires to do both, and that they want, if they haven't already, that they want to build up a clandestine cell dedicated to international terrorist attacks like they have in the past. So what's interesting right now is where will be the next big opportunity for Al-Qaeda. We know that after 2001, Al-Qaeda saw Afghanistan as a big opportunity. After 2003, they saw Iraq as the biggest opportunity because American forces were there and they could be attacked directly. After the start of the Syria war, Syria was seen as a very promising jihadi field, as Al-Qaeda leaders would say. And now what? Will center of gravity still be Syria, Iraq, or will it be somewhere else like Afghanistan, Pakistan, or perhaps the African continent? So time will show. If I should make like a qualified guess, I would say Al-Qaeda is moving to Africa. Al-Qaeda is seeing Africa as the most promising, and I know Africa is a big, big continent. Let's say the Sahel, the Mali region, Western Africa, which is specifically a topic in Zawahiri's latest speeches, where he actually specifically calls on Muslims and jihadis in that region to go and fight on that front. And he's of course alluding to Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, and as some of you will know, Al-Qaeda has had some success lately in unifying the jihadi groups in that region. And there are many advantages of this part of the world that I think are the reason why Al-Qaeda will prioritize that front. First of all, there is financing. The so-called crime terror nexus in West Africa is quite strong, overlapping at times, indistinguishable. The smuggling, the income from smuggling networks in West Africa falling straight into the hands of the jihadis in some cases. So there is money. There is a whole continent with vast, vast areas where it's possible to operate because the local counter-terrorism capabilities are relatively weak. This is why I think Pakistan is not attractive to Al-Qaeda anymore because Pakistani intelligence services are very strong. And this is a controversial topic, I know, but I think Pakistani intelligence services, they're actually, they have hurt Al-Qaeda a lot over the past years. And from Al-Qaeda's perspective, they do not like the Pakistani authorities, even though, there is this whole discussion about supporting the good Taliban and so on. But I think Al-Qaeda is not seeing Pakistan as a future promising arena of operation as much as West Africa at present. Al-Qaeda also likes to insert itself into relatively young insurgencies. Let's say Al-Qaeda had success establishing presence in Afghanistan in '96, when Taliban was a quite young insurgent movement, both in terms of age of the participants and the leaders, but also in terms of that they hadn't existed as a political entity for more than 2 years at that time. And we see now quite astonishing amount of young Salafi-inspired Islamist insurgent movements popping up across the Sahel region, which I think is promising. That Al-Qaeda views as a sort of fertile ground, an opportunity to come in and be accepted as an advisor and to be welcomed there. There is the argument against this, and this is my last point, that Africa will not be attractive to Al-Qaeda because it's alien continent. It's people with different languages. They don't even speak Arabic. It's a different, very different culture from the Arab culture and so on. I think this is not so. This is not such a good argument because Al-Qaeda has historically very much been involved in different African countries since the early 1990s in Somalia, as some of you might remember. One of Al-Qaeda's most successful international terrorist attacks ever was the 1998 bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, which is also a point to make that we know from internal documents Al-Qaeda discussing, where the Americans, African continent is a location that comes up because of the weak state security services, and that would be an easier way, for example, to smuggle a bomb on board an airplane, and which has been attempted as well. So I will stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Anne. Next we have Dr. Thomas Heckhammer, the Director of Terrorism Research at FFI. Dr. Heckhammer has held fellowships at Harvard, Princeton, New York and Stanford universities, and his research has covered themes from terrorist recruitment, terrorist use of the internet, foreign fighters and Islamist ideology. Dr. Heckhammer has published several books, and his articles in International Security on Foreign Fighters and the American Political Science Review on Western jihadist decision-making are some of the most cited in the field, so it's great to have you here. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Aurora, and thanks to George Washington University for hosting, thanks to the Embassy for co-hosting, thanks to the Ambassador for the kind words. While I'm here, let me say about the program on extremism that it has been a fantastic addition to the field of jihadism studies. In the relatively short time it's been around, it's really made a mark with fantastic research. I'm sure the relevant institutions have noticed this and recognized the excellence of the research you're producing. But for what it's worth, let me say that it is great, and those who can fund it, should fund it. I'm going to talk about Europe and the prospects going forward. As you know, Europe has just experienced a historically unprecedented wave of jihadi activity, starting first in the early 2010s with an exodus of foreign fighters to Syria. The total number is somewhere around 5,000, and a wave of attacks, especially from 2015 to 2017, when almost 400 people were killed in jihadi attacks. This is more than the total number of people killed in similar attacks in all previous years. Obviously, this created uncertainty, nervousness. There was, I think, in 2015 in particular, a real continent on edge. A lot of people were asking what is going on and when is this going to end. That's why in 2016, at the end of 2016, I wrote an article trying to look forward in time. And my answer to the question, when is this going to end, was basically never, or at least not in a long time. It was a very pessimistic outlook. It was deliberately pessimistic, where I was basically saying that I expected to see a short-term decline in activity. By the way, by activity I don't necessarily mean execute terrorist attacks, but attempted attacks and foreign fighter activities and so on. So in the activity in the wide sense. I expected a dip in activity in the short term, but a resurgence of activity in the longer term, by which I meant sort of 5 to 10 years. I expected a short-term decline because government countermeasures would dent the IS phenomenon. This is a completely normal and regular occurrence when you have offensives like the one we had in Europe. So law enforcement kind of mobilizes, intelligence services learn about the network and are able to contain it until new networks come along that the services, the governments know less well, and then need time to to detect. So the short-term decline, which I think we're seeing a dip in both executed and attempted attacks in Europe. A short-term decline was entirely predictable. But the reason I talked about a long-term kind of reconstitution or resurgence was because I saw 4 macro trends in Europe relevant to the future of the jihadi movement. The first one being the existence of a very large number of veterans. And we know from history that the veterans often become so-called entrepreneurs, so people who are basically network builders, plot instigators, and so on. And the research of my FFI colleague Peter Nesser has shown this very well, the importance of entrepreneurs. And with all of the people who had gone to Syria and all of the people who had been involved in various types of activity in the mid-2010s, suggested that there was a historically unprecedented reservoir of prospective entrepreneurs. Bearing in mind that all of the activity that we saw in the 2000s or in the 1990s was built on the back of a much, much smaller number of entrepreneurs. Of course, many of them are in prison. The most the best entrepreneurs are probably not around at the moment, but some of them are going to come out of prison for a while because Europe has relatively short sentences for terrorism offenses compared with the US and other regions. The second drive, growing slowly but surely in Europe in absolute terms for a variety of reasons. And so my thinking was, given the existence of entrepreneurs and recruiters, having this pool increase is not a good thing. The third drive, continued existence of conflict in the Muslim world. What happens in Europe is intimately connected with what happens in the Muslim world. The jihadi networks in Europe have always been preoccupied with conflicts in the Middle East, in the wider Middle East. And so that is, of course, a key reason why you had the wave in the 2010s is because of what happened in Syria. So it's obviously impossible to say exactly where the next kind of big conflicts will be in the area, but there are so many kind of structural pressures on many countries in this region that it's a reasonable assumption to say that there will be, in sort of 5 to 10 years' time, there will be some conflicts around to motivate European jihadis. The fourth driver I saw was technological, and it was the observation that in the early and mid-2010s, jihadis had been enjoying unprecedented levels of freedom on the internet and had access to distribution platforms and channels of more or less secret communication of a type that they had not enjoyed in the past and had been a real capability multiplier for them. And at the time, I was writing this in mid-2016, I didn't see this as declining. Today, I'm less pessimistic, primarily because European governments have responded with tougher countermeasures than I expected back in 2016. There has been a remarkable change of mood in Europe with regard to counterterrorism, and governments have implemented measures that would have been politically unthinkable 6 or 7 years ago. And publics are, generally speaking, not protesting very much. So remember, for example, in 2012, 2013, there were big debates in many countries about whether at all to prosecute or criminalize foreign fighting. Now, foreign fighting is banned in most countries across the board, and nobody really makes a fuss when people are prosecuted on return. And the criminalization of foreign fighting is just one small picture of this, a range of other very harsh countermeasures, which affect the future prospects of the movement, I think. In particular, they affect 2 of my 4 drivers. They affect the entrepreneur driver, because the countermeasures are making it more difficult for future entrepreneurs to operate and to build networks and so on. And they have affected the technology driver, and this is very clear. And because, as you all know, there has been a severe crackdown on jihadi users of the internet, and most of the sort of big platforms that IS and others were using in the early 2010s are no longer available, and there is systematic censorship of their propaganda, etc., etc. So, to some extent, taken away their communication platform, and this I think has implications going forward. So we have a slightly new situation, and I think that when future entrepreneurs come out, when they come out of prison in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they will be finding themselves in a different situation from the one that entrepreneurs were in say, 2005 or 10. Still, I am not expecting this phenomenon to go away. I think the ideology will be there. It's preserved in the propaganda that still circulates in certain parts of the internet. It's preserved in the memories and minds of the former activists. And we know from experience, from the past that many of these activists there seem to be in it for life. So this is not going away. Although there seems to be in some quarters a certain, at least certain aversion, at least to IS, to that there's to some extent a backlash against IS's brutality and IS's kind of broken promises. Let me say finally a few words about foreign fighters. Many people wonder how dangerous the foreign fighters stuck in Syria and Iraq are. Some 6 years ago, I wrote an article about the relationship between foreign fighting and terrorist activity in their home countries. And one of the things I did was to look at the propensity for outgoing foreign fighters to subsequently become involved in attack activity at home, and I found that a small proportion of them did. So over the 20-year period from 1990 to 2010, roughly 1 in 10 of the outgoing foreign fighters subsequently became involved in plotting. This, I call this the blowback rate. So not all foreign fighters become terrorists, very simply, but still the proportion is high compared to other demographic variables. So it's a relative, compared to other predictors, it's a pretty good predictor of involvement in terrorism. Now, I've obviously been curious to see what the blowback would be from Syria, and I've tried to keep tabs on blowback. I haven't published anything yet because I think it's still a little early. There's a time lag to the blowback, so it didn't make sense to make up tabs in 2014, for example. But my numbers currently suggest that we're looking at a much lower blowback than 1 in 10. It's more like, at this point, more like 1 in 100. So I count somewhere between 40 and 50 individuals who have been involved in plots in Europe in the 2013 to 2018 timeframe, who had a background from Syria. This is smaller than previous rates for two main reasons. One is that there was less selection into the Syrian theater. It was much easier to go there, especially around 2012, 13, 14. So you didn't get the type of selection for commitment that you had in previous foreign fighter destinations. So it was much harder to make it to Waziristan, let's say, in the late 2000s or early 2010s. And so the people who actually made it there, were so committed and so willing to take risks that they did it. Whereas others kind of fell off along the way. In Syria, everyone, or pretty much anyone, could make it, and so you had also on average the level of ideological commitment was probably lower, and this is reflected then in the proportion of them who go on to more extreme forms of militancy. The other main reason is, of course, the countermeasures, that the governments have been aware of the foreign fighter threat from Syria to a much greater extent than they were with previous foreign fighter contingents. So in the past, people would go to Bosnia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. They would come back, and governments wouldn't really care so much or track them as closely, which is why a good proportion of them went on to do stuff. Whereas with Syria, governments have been keeping close tabs to the best of their ability from the beginning, and so it's been much harder for people, for returning fighters to to get into a sort of a striking position. And the people who the services consider to represent the largest threat among the returnees have, I think, systematically been picked up and kind of dealt with and prosecuted and put in prison. So they've been taken off the street, basically. And this is why you will see, if you look at kind of the involvement, if you look at how many Syria veterans are involved in the plotting, you see that the proportion is quite low. And many people point to this to say that foreign fighters are not dangerous. They say, oh look, we had all these plots, and you only have Syria veterans in a small proportion of them. This, we have to be careful to make this inference, because you have to keep in mind this intervening variable of repression, of basically the police work, which has prevented some of the people who, in other contexts, under less repression, would have been able to strike and drive up the numbers. They are today not able to do that. That's why the numbers are low. So basically, I see the Syria fighters as, posing quite a threat. Although of course they're not all going to become attackers. In fact, in Europe, I suspect that we'll more often see them in the role of network builders. So they'll keep in the background. They are on the radar to such an extent that they're constrained. So we'll see them as kind of eminence grise, or grey eminences, lurking in the background. People that the new recruits will look up to. But it'll be the young people, new generations of activists who will do the heavy lifting. So sum up basically. The situation in Europe is manageable, but it will be costly to deal with the activity that we'll continue to have, and it will require a lot of patience. This is not going away anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And we now have Dr. Cole Bunzel, who's a fellow at the Program on Extremism, and as I said before, a research fellow in Islamic law and civilization at the Yale Law School. His work focuses on the history of Jihadism in Saudi Arabia and the Jihadi Salafi movement more broadly. Recent articles in CTC Sentinel and Jihadika have examined the ideological tensions within the Islamic State and its implications. I'm looking forward to Cole diving into the details of that excellent work now.
Thanks, Ron. I just want to echo the remarks of gratitude by my colleagues. It's great to be here and to see the joining of forces between Program on Extremism and FFI. Hopefully it's not a model that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State can use. I'll try to focus my remarks on the ideological dimension of jihadism, because that's what I've been studying most carefully. By way of preface, though, it might be instructive just to point to some of the recent commentary of one of the leading jihadi ideologues in the Middle East. His name is Abu Qatada al-Filastini. He lives in Jordan in his late 50s. What's interesting is that many of these ideologues and lesser known individuals online have been debating this same panel's subject, which is what does the future hold for jihadism? And in a very difficult to bear listening to 2-hour interview with Abu Qatada, he goes into great depth into his thinking of what is in store for the future of the jihadi movement. This was from a couple of weeks ago. It might be worth noting just at the outset that the term jihadi movement is a term that they themselves use. So the jihadism in this sense, I think Thomas has used the term, it's epistemic community. It's a community that has a sense of itself, and so it uses terms like the jihadi movement, jihadi current to identify itself. So this is what Abu Qatada said just a few weeks ago. He said the jihadi movement today is much greater and much larger than it was 10 years ago. And he waxes very optimistic about its prospects. He says, he goes on to claim, it is expanding, it is not contracting, it is poised to take advantage of future chaos that might be brewing in the Middle East. Despite everything that's happening with the the Islamic State, which, by the way, he has been a fierce opponent of from the very beginning. If you ask me, I think Abu Qatada may very well be right here. This is a movement that is the jihadi movement that has grown exponentially over the past decade and more, and the territorial defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria may be perhaps not a sign of the greater movement's decline and potential fall, but actually just a setback and a larger pattern of ascent. That said, Abu Qatada is not entirely optimistic about what the future holds for the jihadi movement. He acknowledges that there are some severe divisions brewing within the movement. He calls them maladies, amrad, and he says that that we will have to combat these, and that they are basically a product of the fact that the jihadi movement is growing at such a rapid pace. In a previous fatwa from a couple of years ago, he used the term fragmentation or tashazzi to describe what was happening in the jihadi movement writ large. And what he was referring to was not actually the dispute between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which he, and I guess I would agree with him here, he regards as basically a final split. There will not be a bridging of that gap in the near future. But what he was talking about was the fragmentation of the movement just inside of the Al-Qaeda wing of the Islamic State, and talking in particular, as it were. So within Al-Qaeda, we've seen a very heated argument over the past 3 years or so that focuses on the trajectory of the former Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which was originally known as Jabhat al-Nusra, and officially, or more or less, broke ties with Al-Qaeda in July 2016, and then you can say it really left Al-Qaeda in January 2017. So there's a group of ideologues in Jordan and elsewhere, and their leader here is Abu Muhammad al-Muqdisi, a good friend of actually Abu Qatada's, at least originally. He's also in Jordan. This group of ideologues is very, very heavily opposed to HTS and spends a great deal of its time on Telegram criticizing HTS and its leaders. They call HTS Mumayya, which means diluters. They believe that this group has diluted jihad, principles of jihad. It no longer believes in such things as keeping distance, separating from unbelievers. It has basically acknowledged the Islamic status of Turkey. It takes money from from states like that. It has opened its doors to other Islamist groups that don't basically belong in the jihadi community. They see what HTS has done is basically become something like Hamas. It's basically a national liberation movement with an Islamic base. And it's a pretty severe argument you see on a daily basis. And here, actually, Abu Qatada, the one I mentioned before, is on the other side. He believes that there's something actually quite positive about the rise of HTS, that it represents what he calls a jihad ummah, or a jihad of the larger Muslim community movement, one that is more of a big tent movement, and that is necessary if the jihadi movement is really to appeal to a broader base. Al-Muqdisi completely disagrees. His view is that jihad nukhba, or the jihad of an elite, is what is really necessary to lead the movement and stay true to the strict Salafi principles that underlined it for a long time. So there's a great deal of ill will between the Al-Qaeda loyalists in northern Syria and HTS. They criticize each other, and they've imprisoned, HTS has imprisoned some of these men. Though they do give the Al-Qaeda loyalists, who have their own organizations called Tanzim Haras ad-Din, the organization of the Guardians of the Religion, they give them space to operate, and they've done a lot of attacks south and southwest of Idlib, targeting the Assad regime. That tension is a real one, and it's something that we see, I see commented on very, very frequently. On the Islamic State side of the broader division in jihadism, there's been an equally and perhaps even more significant division taking place, and I would say that it is a more purely ideological division. It's focused on the doctrine of takfir, or excommunication, calling somebody another Muslim. And it's a division that we have basically seen cropping up in the movements all the way back since 2014. A few of the most extreme of the extremists in the extremist group, the Islamic State, were put to death by the Islamic State. So if I use words like moderate Islamic State, please know that they're horrible people. And it's not an endorsement of their moderation, it's a relative term. So just thanks. So the reason why the issue of takfir is such an issue for them is because they adhere to Salafi Wahhabi theology very strictly, and according to the most strict interpretation of Wahhabi theology, takfir of so-called polytheists or unbelievers is a duty. It's a requirement, and if you don't fulfill it, then you yourself have fallen into unbelief. So this comes directly from the mouth of the founder of Wahhabism, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who died in 1792. So this is a debate that was ongoing within the group. In more practical terms, it has to do with how large a net of takfir should the group be casting around Syria and Iraq, and more generally in the world. Should the Islamic State consider, say, Muslims who are living in places like Egypt and Libya, are they to be considered prima facie Muslims, or do we consider them apostates because, well, they're not living in the land ruled by Sharia law? There's been a debate about this, and that debate was basically, or there was a sort of a balance that was struck, and that lasted into early 2017, when a bunch of high-level senior leaders in the group were killed, and a few more of the extremists in the Islamic State took control of it's called the Delegated Committee, the executive branch of the Islamic State, and they issued a memorandum in May 2017 establishing the more radical position on takfir as the official doctrine of the Islamic State. The word used was that takfir of polytheists is one of the unambiguous principles of the religion, which was to say then, and this led to a series of refutations by the more moderate scholars in the Islamic State, that position basically says that anyone who disagrees about this particular view on takfir is a heretic who can be killed, which was upsetting to people who had a different view. So they wrote long refutations. This was the first time in my kind of tracking the Islamic State when a lot of the internal tensions boiled over and into the public eye. And so you could see the refutations online on Telegram. It was pretty fascinating until a lot of the people who wrote the refutations died within a couple of weeks and months. So what happened next is Baghdadi intervened to try to restore the balance, as it were. He rearranged the delegated committee. He even put in prison a number of the most radical people, and eventually one of those was executed. And he retracted the memorandum on takfir from May 2017, issued a new statement on takfir that is an audio series in 6 parts, if you want to listen to it. It's very enlightening. Sets everything straight, and basically it looked like a real win for the more moderate scholars in the Islamic State. But as it turned out, there were additional episodes in the audio series that Baghdadi withheld because he was still trying to strike that balance. So the more moderate scholars became increasingly upset. They didn't like this balance, and they started leaking more things to the public. And then they got arrested again, thrown in prison. Most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, the leader of this moderate trend, a guy named Abu Yaqub al-Maqdisi, was executed by the leadership, or what remains of the leadership in eastern Syria. So if you look online today, it's a circus. People don't know what to make of what the Islamic State stands for, who is leading it, what its ideology is. It's a very divided scene. So that kind of ideological incoherence, I think, represents a real problem for the Islamic State going forward. It's not something that, you know, every foot soldier in Iraq strapping on a suicide bomb is aware of. I don't think that that necessarily is going to impede its ability to carry out attacks in certain areas. But the idea that the Islamic State will now be, and it seems to me increasingly that it will be the most tech-fear heavy, with no nuance group in the jihadi movement writ large. I think that that restricts its appeal, and not necessarily meaning that it will enhance Al-Qaeda's appeal. I'm very dubious of the arguments that I've seen about the coming merger between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I don't think that bridge, that divide is bridgeable. There's just too much bad blood. And even some of the people on the Islamic State's more moderate end who seem to be upset enough that they might decamp and leave the Islamic State altogether, they've never said a nice word about Al-Qaeda in this period. So if they're going to rejoin forces with some of their old colleagues in Al-Qaeda, I think it would have to be under a different kind of organizational umbrella. Only time will tell. And you know, just to kind of sum up what I've been saying, basically in 2013, before the rise of the Islamic State, you could see a single, relatively unified jihadi movement with Al-Qaeda at its top. But today, at least what I'm seeing, and particularly online, is 4 distinct trends within the jihadi movement. 2 on the Al-Qaeda orbit and 2 on the Islamic State side. You could call them the more moderate faction of Al-Qaeda, the more extremist faction of Al-Qaeda, and the more moderate faction of the Islamic State, and the more extremist faction of the Islamic State. Of course, they have their own epithets for all of these people. They're either the Dagluters, or the Morjahites, or the Kharijites, or the Manhaj purists, so we can use their terms too. But this, if you pay attention to the discussion that's going on online, it's too bad that we couldn't have Abu Qatada here to enlighten us. You'll see that it's a real divided scene, and I think that is going to color a lot of what we see in this movement going forward. Thanks.
And please thank all the 3 of the speakers there. What I'd like to do now, I guess, is open up the conversation, and obviously we'll get the audience involved here as well. I'm interested, Thomas and Anne, actually, what's your view of Abu Qatada's assessment of the jihadi movement? And what do you think it suggests about how the counterterrorism effort has gone over the last?
Well, it's been said by many observers that the discussion about whether the war on terror has succeeded or failed, right? And there are some obvious failures, I guess, to put it very bluntly, and it is that in spite of all the resources spent in trying to defeat the global jihadism and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and specific organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the jihadi movement seems to be stronger than ever, and there have been some numbers being thrown around. I will not repeat these numbers because I think it's impossible to put a number on how many supporters does the movement have today.